Ranked number one on the list of top most influential historians today by academic influence, pioneer of a big history and interdisciplinary approach encompassing psychology, anthropology, and biology, Professor David Christian is my guest this week. He is a member of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, the Royal Holland Society of Sciences and Humanities, the Royal Society of New South Wales, who is also on the editorial boards of the Global and the Journal of Global History and the Cambridge World History. David Christian's 2011 TED Talk, A History of the World in 18 Minutes, has been seen by more than 8 million viewers. What a pleasure to be talking with the author of around 30 distinct works, including very popular like Maps of Time, This Fleeting World, Future Stories, Mortal Weapons, Power of the Prose, just to name a few. Professor David Christian, welcome to Ink and Insights with Sumit Sharma Samir.
Thank you very much.
David, what is big history and why is there a need of a big history?
Look, I think the simplest way of describing big history is to say that I think every school in the world teaches history. We take it for granted that studying the past is valuable. But why is it valuable? Well, it's valuable because we learn something about the present and maybe even about the future by studying the past. We get perspective as a minimum, but we may actually learn particular lessons because of patterns in the past that we suspect will be repeated in the future. Now, if it's true that learning from the past is crucial to understanding the present, then it ought to be true that you shouldn't study just little selected bits of the past of my country or my family or my nation or my religion, for example. You should be studying the whole of the past. I mean, I hope the logic is clear. So that's what big history does. It simply takes that logic very seriously and asks the question, if instead of, I grew up in England, so I learned about English history. If instead of just learning about English history in a globalized world, I need to learn about the history of the whole world, I need to learn about the history of humanity, how can I study the whole of the past? And as soon as I started asking myself that question, which I found myself asking in mid-career in the 1980s, really, I found myself pushed back and back and back. If it's true that studying the whole of the past ought to give us perspective on the present, and what is the whole of the past? It's certainly the history of the world. In other words, in all people, not just a particular nation or country or culture or religion. But how far back could you go? So very soon I found myself saying, well, we should be talking about the whole of humanity. And I do still believe very strongly that courses on the history of humanity ought to be being taught to every child in the world nowadays, in today's interconnected world. But what is humanity? Humanity is part of the biosphere. So that means we need to talk about biology, how humans evolved. To understand how humans evolved, of course, we have to understand how life emerged. So we're now in biology, and then eventually to understand how life evolved, we have to understand how planet Earth was formed, and you can see how the questions go back and back and back and back, until eventually the question was, how was the universe created? So I found myself asking all of these questions and saying to myself, well, can you assemble a story? It won't be a perfect story, but what it will do is it will use the best available evidence, the best story I can find today about questions like, how did the universe begin? Or how was planet Earth created? Or how did life begin? Or when did the first humans exist? So I thought my job is to assemble the best answers I can find, and the most up-to-date answers, and put them together into the sort of story historians do all the time. You know, as a kid, I heard historians putting together different bits and pieces of the story of England. How I'm trying to put together different bits and pieces of the story of the universe. So that's what big history is. It simply takes the idea that history teaches you about the present and future, and it stretches that idea to say, well, if that's true, then we ought to be studying the whole of history, back to the beginning of the universe. What would such a story look like? Sorry, that's a long answer to your question, but that's the best answer I can give.
Absolutely, David. I mean, that's very convincing, in fact. But I'm sure that there must be a lot of challenges in that. What challenges you face in sort of synthesizing disciplines such as cosmology, biology, and history into one unified narrative?
Look, there are huge challenges, but these are the challenges that scholars everywhere face all the time. It doesn't matter what your field is. You may be interested in, I don't know, the evolutionary history of dinosaurs, and you face the challenge of looking for bits of evidence that are relevant and assembling them in a story. So it's the same challenge scholars face. Perhaps the most difficult challenge is not the scholarly one, because nowadays, if you want to find the dominant opinion about the origins of the universe, or the dominant opinion about the origins of life, it's easy to find
Right.
in the internet. You can find cutting edge research very easily nowadays.
Absolutely.
So that's not the most difficult challenge, strangely. The most difficult challenge is people's resistance to the idea that this project is possible. And I've found over 30 years now a deep, deep resistance to scholarship, research, teaching that crosses many discipline boundaries. It's as if scholarship, and this is not just in one country, I think in every country in the world, scholarship takes the idea of discipline so seriously. It creates, it's very like nation states, it creates frontier controls, border guards, and you get gunned down if you try to run through a disciplinary site. So the resistance to this idea is huge, and it takes, one of the forms it takes is the idea that if you try to tell the story of the whole of everything, what you'll end up with is a kind of intellectual pap. It'll be so thin. But again, that's an argument I really can't take seriously, because we know perfectly well that wonderful minds like Einstein or Newton
Right.
didn't take that argument seriously. They were convinced that there are rich stories to be found if you ask huge interdisciplinary questions. So I never took that story seriously. What scholarship needs is two things. It needs depth and it needs breadth.
Right.
It says the depth bit, modern scholarship does very well. It does superbly. It rewards people for going deep, deep, deep into a particular territory. The breadth bit we've lost sight of entirely in the modern world. And it may be simply because there is so much information. The only way we can deal with it is by breaking it up into bits and pieces. And that creates a sense that looking across the whole of scholarship is an impossible or naive project. Now, I, of course, think that is nonsense. That real understanding of the world requires both breadth and depth. I think of big history sometimes as the view from the mountaintop. And that's why I called my last book on big history Origin Story, because in most societies in the world, people have understood the importance of breadth. This is true in indigenous communities, in traditional religious communities. The Christian religion, which I grew up in, has a story that is a history of everything.
Right.
It's in the Christian Bible.
Yeah.
But it's as if in our modern scientific world, we know so much that we've lost sight of the story of everything. But if you look for it, it's there. I mean, I've been teaching it for 30 years, and it's as much there as any other story. I'm a Russian historian, so, I did the conventional stuff. I taught Russian history.
Yes.
Well, if you think about it, that's a completely crazy project. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people over many centuries. How can you possibly say something sensible about that in a short university course? The same applies to all scholarship. Yeah.
True, David. True. In fact, some of the philosophies from our part of the world also guides us to sort of, introspect and understand, that our life is connected to the larger whole. So unless we understand that, we can't make sense of individual silos life, right? So
Yes.
I completely agree with what you are saying. What major patterns or trends have you observed across the entirety of big history that helps us understand the future of humanity?
Well, look, I thought of myself very much as a historian. Historians tell stories. They try to assemble a lot of information about the past into a coherent narrative. And there's a very good reason for that, is that narratives, our minds are so designed that we find narratives much, much easier to understand than raw facts. So historians try to understand or try to assemble a lot of information into a story. I was trying to do the same thing. And so first I set myself the goal of not necessarily of understanding the history of everything, but finding a coherent story. And though it took several years, I found there is a coherent story to be told. But you're absolutely right. There are questions, of course, and the questions are, what are the big patterns that you see over and over again? Now, here I'm more hesitant, but I can tell you what I think is one powerful answer to that question. And I say it without total confidence, but it is that we know, or at least contemporary science, the best story available in contemporary science is that the universe began about 14 billion years ago as a tiny explosion of energy. And the universe has been expanding ever since. It's been expanding and it's been cooling. But one other thing that has been happening is that the early universe was extraordinarily simple. In fact, for the first split second, there was no matter. There was just energy. And energy in one form, but then energy very, very rapidly, within a billionth of a second. Energy itself split into different types. And then within a few seconds, some of that energy congealed to form what we call matter. So within just the first split second of the universe's history, we can see a simple universe that is capable of creating more complex things. And that is the pattern you see over and over again, that this universe began very simple, but as its energies and matter swirl around, they get arranged in new combinations. And some of those combinations are very temporary and passing and ephemeral. But some of those combinations get locked in and they turn out to be new. And they have the quality that complexity theorists describe as emergence. Wow. In other words, rearrange atoms of hydrogen and oxygen in a very particular way, and you get something you never had before.
धेरै टाइम छैन है बिहे गर्नु छ भने गरिहाल नत्र घरबाट मलाई अन्त्य बिहे गर्दिनु
भर्खर 3 वर्ष भयो एमबीबीएस जोइन गरेको 5 वर्षको कोर्स हो के भो जम्मा छ एक्सक्यूज मी सर मेरो 5 वर्षको कोर्स 3 वर्षमा सकाउन मिल्दैन
गेट आउट
हेलो
के सोच्यो त
के सोच्ने मैले प्रिन्सिपलसँग पनि कुरा गरिसकेँ। 3 वर्षमा पनि के हुन्छ? के हुन्छ 3 वर्षमा?
के भयो भाइ? ल बस। साउजी एक कप चिया। कसले भन्यो 3 वर्षमा केही हुँदैन भनेर? यो हेर, एलआइसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजनामा 3 वर्षमा पैसा फिर्ता हुन्छ।
ए हो र?
जीवन बीमाको साथमा धनवृष्टि 3 वर्षमा। एलआइसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजना। एलआइसी नेपाल।
What an interesting explanation that is. I mean, it brings us much closer to the construct of spirituality in a way that we understand, and getting back to sort of self, and which is pretty simple to the whole idea of complexities that the world has evolved to. That's very interesting. Tell us about your ambitious book, Future Stories, What's Next, which was published in 2022. What future stories does it tell us, David?
Yeah, look, as I did as I taught big history, when I began at first, we really didn't know what we were doing, and I had a marvelous group of colleagues who gave lectures in different disciplines, but at first we couldn't see a coherent story. Then we began to see a story, and then I remember one time I taught the course and I gave the final lecture in the course, and the final lecture in the course ended today.
Right.
Because, this is a story about the past, so of course it ends today. And a student came up to me afterwards and said, she was a very smart student, she said she loved the course. She found it brought together so many different forms of information for her. But she said, you cannot end in the moment. She said, this is like taking us to a cliff edge and leaving us there. She said, you have to talk about the future.
True.
And
yeah.
As soon as she said that, I thought, she's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So from then on, the final lecture in the course, we began to talk about the future. Now, we had no idea what we were doing. But
Right.
what we do understand is that if you are foolish enough or arrogant enough to try to teach people a history of 14 billion years, then it is absurd not to ask the question, will the momentum of this story teach us something about the future? So that's why I began, from then on, every course I gave in big history ended with some thoughts about the future. And of course, they were very kind of a bit chaotic. And eventually I felt it was really important for me to try to systemize my ideas about the future. And I realized that as someone with an interest in what we mean by the future, what is the future philosophically speaking, how much prediction is possible, were old-fashioned methods of predicting completely absurd, or should we dismiss them, or was there something in them? Are we better at predicting the future now than in the past? All these questions were swarming around. And then the other question, how do animals predict the future? Because we know they do. If a deer wants to drink water from a water hole, it will think about the prediction, are there lions there? It will make a choice, and it will be a probabilistic choice. So even bacteria think about the future. So anyway, I thought, I don't know of any book that is a sort of user's guide to the future. And that's the title of the English version of Future Stories, a user's guide to the future. So I thought, well, I don't need to claim to be an expert on the future to write a sort of introductory guide. So that was the idea behind it. And I felt I had to talk a bit about what philosophers have said about the future, what scientists say, what Einstein said. Einstein, of course, fantastically interesting. on the future, because he one of the things he proved is that our sense of time is not simultaneous. Right. That your time may be slightly different from mine, depending on where we are, how fast we're traveling, and so on. So,
exactly.
And then also, I thought I need to talk a bit about how animals predict the future, including bacteria. So there's a whole section on the biochemical mechanisms that allow bacteria to make predictions. Should I turn this way or that way? Which is the most dangerous. And why all animals have methods of predicting that give them slightly better than 50% odds of getting it. They don't just toss a coin. They have ways of predicting that can improve the odds slightly. And that's built into the idea of natural selection, that some animals behave more successfully and that they're more likely to reproduce, so their genes get into the next generation. And then finally, I thought I need to talk about humans and how we predict, and to ask the question whether today we are better at predicting the future than we were at the past. And the final part of the book, I thought it would be cowardly to write a book on the future and then not make any predictions. So the final part of the book is my best shot at scenarios about the future at different scales. And this is all big history type thinking. So scenarios at the scale of 100 years, scenarios at the scale of millions of years, and finally, scenarios about the future of the whole universe. So that's what the book does.
Yeah, David. So, there are some arguments made by historians that, the authority from mankind is slipping away and has been taken, been dominated by the machine, which is likely to grow in the future. Say, for example, they are talking about the artificial intelligence and all of the stuffs. And simultaneously, there are also historians who are talking and claiming that the institutions that were built during 18th and 19th century to address some of the pressing concerns of human beings is of no longer use, because the mankind is changing very fast. Do you agree with those kind of visions or arguments?
It is true that it is certainly true that the pace of change has accelerated very sharply. It's certainly true that suddenly, in the last 100 years or 200 years, humanity collectively has acquired powers that it never could have dreamed of before. And it's also true that these powers are potentially dangerous and destructive. I mean, we just before I was born, we invented nuclear weapons. That is to say, weapons that could ruin much of the biosphere within just a few days. And I've lived with them all my life. And we also know that we now we are changing the planet on such a scale that we're transforming it, and we don't really know what we're doing. So this is all very dangerous. There's no doubt that we can see dangers. But I think there is a tendency in a lot of debate today to focus on the negative. And this is not to say the negatives are entirely wrong, but to not see the other side. And there are reasons for this. One of them is simply what I call the blood bias of the media. The established media, but also social media, love blood, to put it crudely. And there's neurological reasons for this. Our neurological systems are designed so that we react much more strongly to danger and to fear and to anxiety and to threats than we do to ice cream, or to positive things. We're designed like that. So if you want to sell a newspaper, or if you want to become a successful influencer, Talk about stuff.
Right.
Now, if that's true, then it follows that most of the news we get day in, day out is biased towards the negative.
Right.
Now, go back to what I was saying earlier about the universe, its staggering capacity for creativity. And you can ask the same questions about human beings, because human beings, for better or worse, are collectively incredibly creative. No, to put it strongly, no species in 4 billion years has had the power or creativity that our species is showing right now. We live at a turning point in planetary history. But that creativity is not just negative, it's positive.
Right.
There are so many reasons for thinking that the changes of the last 2 centuries have caused undoubtedly colossal suffering on a vast scale. That's true. But they have also they created well-being on an unprecedented scale. And again, you need historical perspective to see this. I studied the 19th century Russian peasantry. The level of health of the majority of the world population, the level of nutrition, the level of personal security is much higher than it was on average 2 or 3 centuries ago. So because of the blood bias of the media, it is very important for us to correct. And correct means doing something which is a bit difficult, which is looking for the positives. Now you look at our staggering collective creativity as a species, and artificial intelligence is part of that.
Right. And
we should expect both positives and negatives from these things. All disruptive technologies have created great fear when they first appeared. And for many people, that fear was justified. They destroyed jobs. They destroyed lives in some cases. But there were also in retrospect, the positive sides to them.
Right.
So I am actually optimistic in future stories. I believe not that the future will be utopian. It won't be any more utopian than today's world is. But I also think it won't be dystopian. If Hollywood makes films about the future, or Bollywood makes films about the future, they'll be dystopian, because it's much more fun telling dystopian stories than utopian stories. But the future won't be extremely catastrophic. It won't be extremely beautiful. But I do believe we will get through. We will sort of muddle through. And there are many reasons for saying this. One is the speed with which people have got linked up globally. So what is emerging is a kind of global humanity with a increasingly shared vision of the future. That didn't exist when I was a child. When I was a child, traveling from England to France it was like traveling to Mars.
Absolutely.
Today, I'm guessing if I flew from Sydney to Kathmandu and I walked down the street in Kathmandu, I'm guessing that I would see a lot of people dressed in more or less the same way as people in Sydney. Not everyone, but I would see a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's completely new. So we are becoming one world in a sense that was inconceivable just a century ago. I think of climate change. It's possible to be very pessimistic about climate change. But then I think about how politicians and governments thought about climate change 50 years ago.
Yeah.
There were no ministries for climate change. There was no. Today, we live in a world in which every member of the United Nations has signed up to the Paris climate goals.
Yeah.
Now, cynicism is quite appropriate here. We won't meet the Paris goals. I think that's pretty clear by now. But
Right.
watching the evolution of sustainable energy technologies and comparing what I see with what I expected 20 years ago, it's an incredibly impressive achievement. So there are many reasons for resisting the blood bias of the media. And the final reason, again, I'm waffling on, Sumit, but the final reason is just that if we are to build a better future, then one of the weapons we will use, or one of the tools we will use to build it, is optimism.
Right.
We have to believe that there are solutions to these problems, because if we don't believe that, we won't find the solutions. So these are reasons for thinking that the opinions you described in your question need to be taken very seriously, but they should not be regarded as the only serious ways of understanding how the world is today.
That's very positive, David, and I agree to your point of view. My last question to you is, how do you see the role of individual human agency with the larger forces at play in shaping history?
Yeah. How can I put it? One of the analogies I've used, because of big history, is one of the, for most of the history of life on Earth, life consisted of single cells. Then, about 1 billion years ago, it could have been earlier, individual cells started collaborating. And then eventually what evolved were cells that were particularly good at collaborating. Their DNA, you can see this by studying the DNA of multicellular organisms. The DNA includes a lot of genes whose main purpose is communication with other cells that are part of the same body. Okay, right. Or the sharing of energy, or the sharing of information, or collaboration. So, and eventually, multicellular organisms evolve. Now, this is a staggering example of what I called earlier emergence, because you think of a human body, 1 trillion cells. I don't know the exact number. 1 trillion cells. And they collaborate. They all have the same DNA. That's one reason they collaborate. But the second reason they collaborate is because the survival of each individual cell in your body depends on the survival of the larger organism. Absolutely. Now, if we think of us individuals as individual cells, we're each of us concerned with our own survival. But our own survival depends on the survival of something much larger than ourselves. And today, that larger entity is not England or Nepal, or Papua New Guinea or Russia. That entity is humanity. The survival of, I'm old enough that my survival, but the survival of my grandchildren, which I care about deeply, will depend on the success with which humanity manages to collaborate. Can governments around the world manage to avoid the catastrophe of war or the slower catastrophe of catastrophic climate change. That's what it depends on. So that's one way of looking at the role of individuals in all of this. But there's another, which is that some cells in a body play a much more important role. They have much more. Think of cancer cells. This is, they can have a catastrophic impact on the whole body. Or hormones. Some positive hormones can have a very positive effect on the whole body. And the same is true of human beings, that some individuals have an outsized influence. I'm watching the American election at the moment, and I watch it with an extreme fascination, because I know that the results are going to shape the future of humanity.
Yes.
And then the final thing is that every cell does contribute something to the working of this system. And you can set yourself the aim of being a cancer cell or a hormone or an endorphin, positive. Yeah. Sorry, that's a pretty murky answer to your question, but
No, that's
we
very profound, in fact.
we grew up in a very individualistic society, and capitalism encourages us to think of ourselves as individuals fighting for our own future. But in fact, that's again part of the blood bias of the media. What is underestimated is the staggering extent of collaboration and cooperation. Suddenly we find ourselves in a world where if there is a catastrophic landslide or earthquake in Nepal, which there was not long ago, people in countries around the world, people in South America, people in Pacific Islands, will write out checks and send them to aid organizations. Now, that's not going to get reported in the news, but it's the sort of example of an emerging collaborative humanity that tends to get neglected when we let ourselves be seduced by the blood bias of the media.
Right. David, what a profound thinking. And on that note, I'd like to, say thank you once again for your time. I'm really fortunate to have you on my show.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.